In political science, populism is the idea that society is separated into two groups at odds with one another: the pure people and the corrupt elite. Across the globe, populist leaders are managing to once again create nationalistic influence in countries that already have long histories of enduring the repercussions that can come from populist leadership. Reaching as far as Hungary to the Philippines, from the Netherlands to Brazil, a rise in what starts as populism and quickly leads to far-right authoritarianism is threatening democracies far and wide. Today on the Spent the Rent podcast, we discuss populism, Trumpism, and the global rise of the alt-right with University of Oregon graduate student Kaz Zaidi. Welcome to the Spent the Rent podcast. I am your host, SelfEsteem BoatWillie. My guest today is University of Oregon graduate student Kaz Zaidi. Kaz, thank you for coming back to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me again. It's great to be back.
I always enjoy talking to you. You've been coming into the barbershop for quite a while now, and every time we have spirited discussions about politics and global affairs, and every time you leave, the customers that are waiting after are like, that guy was awesome.
Well, that's nice to know. It's nice to know people saying nice things behind my back.
We just kind of, I think one of the things I really like is that we'll talk about stuff very fairly. You know, we'll call balls and strikes on our own side. We're very, progressive, and we'll call balls and strikes pretty fairly. Sometimes that gets us into trouble because going by some kind of honor code sometimes can hurt your party's chances, but whatever. I care about integrity. So thank you for coming. Today I thought we could discuss populism. This is something that I'd like to kind of get to the meat of it and what it really means, and so that the listener can kind of get something out of this, because I think a lot of times people think populist, it means popular, and that's not that simple. So I said in the intro, basically there's, in populism, in political science, there's a theory that there's two groups of people. There's the disenfranchised voter, basically, and then the corrupt elite. So what would you say, how would you define populism?
All right, so I think it's useful to take a step back and think about when these terms were first used. The term populism was first used to describe a very particular movement, which was in the southern United States in the 1880s and 1890s, the People's Party. And I think in 1892, they got about 8.5% of the vote for a presidential candidate, which is pretty impressive. And they came out of this group called the Farmers Alliance, so they were very much a true grassroots movement. And one of the things that was really interesting about them was that they were cutting across the race divide. So you had groups of black and white farmers down in the south who were organizing themselves because the government, neither political party was giving them what they needed. And so they started doing their own form of political organizing. And obviously this is a threat to established elites and party hierarchies. And so everything we know about populism and understand about it kind of comes from that one moment.
Right, and that's like a quick Google search. That's one of the first things that comes up. And like you said, 8% in a third party is substantial.
Really,
I mean, 5 is good,
Yeah.
So, and then you said that it was cross, race. Was it still, because a lot of times with populism, especially on the right, you'll see an anti-immigrant rhetoric. Was that also kind of...
I mean, there was certainly a lot of that. I'm no expert on the People's Party.
Sure.
And from what I've read, there was a broad spectrum of people, some of whom were very sort of racially supremacist.
Right.
But what was unusual was that people were trying to build bridges rather than dealing with a black constituency and a white constituency. They were trying to break that barrier down and say, what are our common interests?
And that's the thing that, I mean, realistically... When you look at American history, there's things like this movement that weren't probably a bad thing at the time, So now what we're going to be discussing a lot of is like fascism, essentially. It's a push using populist approach because it'll get people's heartstrings, essentially. But in the beginning, I think some of these kind of these movements start from a good place, you know?
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about populism now, I was speaking with one of my friends, and I said I'm going to be doing a podcast on populism, and she goes, "What is populism?" And I think that's exactly the point, which is that it kind of is whatever you choose to call it. People confuse it with demagoguery, which it isn't necessarily. And if we're looking for a definition, I think it is essentially this idea that you are stepping away from establishment structures, so you're anti-establishment, and that doesn't mean you are radically left or radically right.
Right.
It means that all you think is that the elites that exist are not providing solutions for the people. And once you kind of step away from elites and the hierarchies and structures that exist, the field is wide open. And the good thing about that is that people can come up with innovative solutions to problems rather than getting stuck on, sort of machine-style politics.
Right.
The bad thing about it is without those established structures, people's passions can run out of control, and it's very easy to manipulate people on the basis of finding a scapegoat or a common enemy.
And that's the thing, the manipulation that I think we're seeing with Trump, because I do not in my heart of hearts believe that he has the best interest of his followers in mind. I think and this is where we talked about this before we hit record, that what happens with democratic socialism or just populist movements in general is that when the person that takes control of the situation, their intention could be like Bernie Sanders, for example. People, would you consider, I don't want to get off track, but would you consider Bernie Sanders to be a populist candidate?
Yeah, I would do.
See, and I would as well. But here's the thing is that scares people away from that concept, is that maybe if a Bernie Sanders gets elected, and he's proven by his track record of 250 years of service that he is consistent in his messaging. Now, if he does get elected, which I hope, does that mean that the next person, if some of these things change, and then the next person's more dictatorial, is more of a dictator, are they going to then take the kind of democratic socialist movement and then make it more about themselves? Now, anyone that's wanting to complain about that because they're trying to reelect a Trump is ridiculous, because the truth is he is literally about himself. He says it's not hidden. And so I don't understand. I just can't wrap my head around why the supporters, and I'm not trying to call out the supporters as being wrong. I get why they're there, because they are disenfranchised by the elite. He promised to drain the swamp. I didn't think he meant, or his supporters didn't think he meant his own administration, but it's difficult because he literally will say, "I alone can do it," and that's where you run into problems with populist candidates, because that's fascism.
Yeah,
and then you see that in the socialist type countries like Venezuela with Hugo Chavez back in the day, where he was like, "I'm smarter than the collective."
And talking about Chavez did some brilliant stuff early on.
Yeah.
And Venezuela was in a really difficult situation, and he was very popular because he was helping out the people,
right,
and he was rooting out corruption. But then he became the very thing that he was fighting against, because when you're in power, it's very tempting to see anyone who opposes you as an enemy rather than someone that disagrees with you. And when you have the unaccountable power of a state apparatus behind you, you can do a huge amount of damage to people's lives.
Right.
And then get used to doing that. That becomes your go-to reflexive way of responding to enemies. And in Chavez's case, it was absolutely the case that the CIA and various other agencies were trying to, at best, undermine him, possibly more than that. But because of that, he saw everybody around him as an enemy. And it's kind of the same thing that happened with Stalin and various other dictators that started out left-wing, shall we say.
Right. Because that's, in the intro, I used a clip of Hitler. And anytime Hitler's name gets brought up, and you're talking about different forms of government, people will say, "Oh, he was a socialist," and it's like what you had told me. Or I was talking to James Barber this morning, and he was saying, "Yeah, he was a nationalist socialist." That's a much different animal.
Yeah.
Because when you're, speak on that. Then what nationalism really is in socialism as well.
Yeah. So the critical thing about socialism is that it's a global ideology. The idea is that if any of us are unequal or suffering from injustice, then all of us are complicit in that, wherever they are in the world. And obviously this is a threat to established elites, to nations, and that's part of the reason why a lot of people have had huge problems with socialism, with communism over time. But when it comes to the kind of sorry, let me rewind. When it comes to nationalist socialism, what we have there is the idea that there is one group of people that is deserving of the fruits of socialism, right? That is deserving to have wealth shared, that is deserving to have public services and access, and other people aren't.
Right.
And that's what makes the difference, is that it isn't socialism because it isn't for everyone. It's only for white people or left-handed people or whatever.
Or wealthy.
Wealthy, exactly.
And because, Bernie Sanders uses the wealth gap as his push for social...
he talks about corporate socialism.
Right, for populism. Today we see, and granted this is not socialist realm, but today we see tweets from Donald Trump where he called out the progressive candidates. Like, he didn't use their names, but AOC and Omar and Tlaib. And he says, why don't you go back to where you came from?
Yep.
And with the exception of Omar, where she's from Somalia, she's born in Somalia. But once you because did you get citizenship in the States? You have dual citizenship.
I'm not a citizen yet, but I will. Like, I'm going through the process.
Because your wife is, and the second that you become a citizen, you are as much of an American as I am, regardless. And I, that's. Oh, this is the part that irks me so much because when he calls that out and says, why don't you go back to where you came from? AOC is working in where she came from, in New York. And the same is true for Tlaib. But that mentality is dangerous,
yep.
And that,
there's a definite, like, whiteness is rightness mentality.
Yeah.
And, one of the sort of I saw this video a long time ago with a Republican, I think he was a Texas state representative, grilling some woman. The woman was Hispanic, and in this process he says, you're biased towards immigrants because you're an immigrant. And she goes, actually, no, I'm not. My family's been here for longer than there's been in America.
Right.
And also, I'm a daughter of the American Revolution. So the idea that say brown skin equates to otherness or not belongingness is ridiculous, especially when you get into the southwest of the United States, where there were Hispanic people, literally hundreds of years before the first American, sort of white Americans, set foot in the area.
Right. And just America isn't just the United States.
Indeed.
It's definitely two continents, and so, yeah, it's pretty nauseating when you see those kind of tweets because it just shows this separatist mentality. Yeah. So I wrote down a lot of stuff to cover. I think we kind of touched on populism and socialism and populism in fascism. And the big thing that gets the push about, one of the things I really wanted to address is a global rise of the alt-right. We've seen it in America, and we're seeing, people coming out of the shadows. Obviously, that's cloaked with racism and it starts as anti-establishment, but you have to decide who, like the people that say the Jew-run media, which is just so hateful and so wrong. So it starts with the anti-immigrant rhetoric, but we're seeing what's happening, and in I know that if Trump gets reelected, it's the walls will fall off of any type of stop against this. And you had mentioned that what happens is a breakdown and a degradation of the institutions. And I want you to speak on that a little bit more. I think this is something that Putin, his meddling in the 2016 election, that was the main goal, was a breakdown in pride in the American institutions. Can you speak more on that?
Yeah, so I was actually... I was a teaching assistant for Intro to Political Science, the last term gone, and one of the books that the undergraduates were reading was called How Democracies Die, and it's by two political scientists. I can't remember their names, I'm afraid. And their basic argument was that most democracies don't die through a revolution or through a war; they get eroded from the inside. And effectively what happens is you get an anti-democratic leader getting elected through democratic means. And then that person sets about establishing their hold over every area of public life. They put their people in place, and those people are put in place for one reason and one reason
it's only. To like abolish the department, essentially.
Exactly. And you look at the fact that like large swathes of the federal government just have no people anymore.
Right.
Yeah, there are so many
there's no State Department.
There's no State Department. There's acting secretaries of everything.
Right.
And that does two things. One of which it means you don't get much work done, but also you don't have any accountability.
Right.
The reason you have cabinet members, the reason you have senior civil servants is so that everything that occurs has a chain of accountability.
And checks and balances. Yeah. I mean, you see that right now. Trump just said that, where Trump was saying, I like this whole, because Acosta stepped down because he basically gave a pass to a billion dollar pedophile.
Yeah.
And so he resigns, and Trump says, oh, this is good. You can see the shit-eating grin on his face, where he's like, okay, now I have an acting labor secretary. I like this acting thing because you don't have to get approved through the House and Senate, and so they just get pushed. It's just the Senate, right? It approves them. But so they just go straight through, and there's no accountability. How is that any different than a country like Venezuela with Chavez?
I mean, it isn't.
And
I think this is the key point, which is that sort of going back to the theme of populism, that when you are in an oligarchic situation, which I think is pretty much the case around the world, the 40 years worth of neoliberal policies, cutting taxes, attacking the state, has created this situation where all over the world we have this kind of global aristocracy emerging. These people, they can't be taxed effectively because, if you tax them in Panama, they'll move to the Cayman Islands.
Right.
If you tax them in the Cayman Islands, they'll move to Switzerland. And because they can move around, but the populations that they rule over or that they get their money from can't move around.
They don't
as
have
easily.
the flexibility.
Yeah. So because we don't have any global governance system, any global system of accountability for things like tax evasion, it's very difficult to get that class of people to pay their fair share.
Right.
And that gives them massively disproportionate power. The other thing that occurs, and the Koch brothers are kind of the past masters at this, they're the people that perfected it, is this thing called astroturfing. Which literally the phrase means fake grassroots movements.
Right.
So you will find all kinds of different groups on the right that don't really have any popular basis of support. They're not subscription-based organizations. They have a tiny sort of core of people who are paid for by billionaires.
Right.
And then they give the appearance of being a popular movement.
And it's usually called freedom parties.
Yeah.
Ironically, I wrote down a list globally, but I wrote down a list of some of the parties. In the Netherlands, they have the Party for Freedom. In Austria, it's the Freedom Party. In Germany, it's an alternative for Germany. Spain, it's the Vox Party. There's all these different groups that are starting up, like you're saying, that are not... and they're starting to gain representation, 10%, 12%, whatnot, in elections. But you're talking more specifically in America, where these astroturf... I've never heard that phrase, and that makes perfect sense, because you'll see, super PACs is another... Yeah. It's an example to where there's just funding. So in Citizens for United, the Senate rule, or the Supreme Court ruling, it gave money speech, or basically anybody that's... a dollar is more valuable than a human almost. And so, you see these pushes, that Michelle Bachmann's an example of where she's got enough funding behind her that she gets this small little 10% representation, but it has this loud voice, and it's dangerous.
And two areas where that's really obvious is abortion and immigration.
Right.
Where if you look at the polling, time and time again, you see that most Americans want comprehensive immigration reform.
Right.
And most Americans are... I don't like the phrase pro-choice, pro-life dichotomy, but essentially they support the right of a woman to be in charge of her own reproductive abilities. And yet, if you were to look at the representation in the media, you would think that it was a 50-50 divide.
It's because of the pure money behind it.
And that's because there is big money behind it. There is quite a sophisticated network of organizations, kind of overlapping organizations that are funded by oligarchs, and as we're discovering, not necessarily oligarchs within this country. I think some of the links between, one of the vulnerabilities the Russians went after was the National Rifle Association, for example. They've very much seen here are areas where public sentiment is not being motivated by what people actually feel. It's being motivated by massive PR campaigns. And that puts a disproportionate amount of power in the hands of a very small group of people. If we can be the people that are driving that conversation.
Well, the NRA was originally started for gun owners, and now it's for gun producers.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically just a lobbying firm for the manufacturers, so they basically... and so if you oppose the NRA, it's not like you're opposing the Second Amendment. You're opposing people wanting to create zero regulation so that, I had a customer of mine, and he's a good kid. He really is. But he made this statement about the NRA where he said, be careful. I don't think we were talking about just the NRA. We were talking about gun rights. And he said, be careful trying to create any type of regulation because the amount of casualties, if the Second Amendment is repealed, would be far greater than the amount are dying currently in schools. And I just thought, I looked at him and I was like, wow, you need to be careful who you say that to, because what you're telling people is that the death of their child is just, collateral damage for you to be able to have a fucking toy.
Yeah.
And
I think that there's one of the other things is the rise of social media. And the fact, so there's two elements there as well. One of which is it produces a huge amount of data that people can then analyze and go, okay, well, what arguments are working and what arguments aren't?
Yes.
And if you are totally cynical and you care about nothing except whatever goal you're being paid to achieve, you'll look at this vast amount of data and say, okay, so only 10 people responded to this argument that we put out, but 100,000 responded to this one. So we can, use effectively a form of like really targeted marketing analytics to kind of manipulate the fabric of reality almost.
Right, and that's what Trump, I truly believe, I don't know if it's Kushner, I know that there's a specific person that's organizing the analytics, and they used and manipulated fear to go, mixed with Putin, obviously. I don't know if they were actually colluding together, but it was simultaneous to where they were looking at separating people. I mean, obviously the Bernie voters, I was one of them that they stoked the flames. Now, I still truly believe the stuff about Clinton, though. I don't know what the trade-off would be. If Clinton was president right now, we'd be at war with Iran.
Yeah.
So,
and this is, again, going back to populism, this is why populism is attractive.
Why it works.
Because the simple fact is that I think at the most basic level, the choice between Clinton and Trump was one of, do you want the nonsense that's undeniably going to occur in foreign countries, or do you want it to occur in the United States?
Right.
And in that sense, there are a lot of people who supported Clinton who are imperialists. And the thing that bothers them is not that there is unaccountable behavior, or that rich people are getting richer while ordinary working people are still not entitled to a living wage.
Right.
What bothers them is that the stuff that they've been doing to other countries has come here.
Right.
And in that sense, Trump has been a real shock to what we might call the liberal elite.
Yeah.
And there is definitely
an
illiberal elite as well.
And that's something I really wanted to touch on as well, because there's this push inside of the Democratic Party. We're in a primary, so you're going to see a lot of infighting. And people on social media are like, oh no, don't call out the center. Don't call out anybody in your party. That's literally what a primary is for, so that you can put people's beliefs and whatnot on the table. But here's the thing. You get this push from a Joe Biden, for example, who the people that support him are like, we need to get someone that could beat Trump. Yeah. Which polls mean nothing, first of all, because we won't see how much of the millennials will turn out. What do you say about the way that they try to squash progressive movements that are populist, that might actually become attractive in the general election, when they say, don't rock the boat too much, we need somebody that's status quo? It statistically has not been working.
I mean, at the argumentative level, the argument that, and this is the argument that the left has been pushing in the UK as well for up until Jeremy Corbyn was elected, this sort of neoliberal argument that like we can win over people on the centre right by going, hey, we're going to do the same stuff as the other guy, we just don't believe in it.
Right.
And you think, well, what is that?
Right.
You know? The idea that you will be able to win over a group of people by giving them a watered down version of what they're getting from their own party that they have a kind of tribal loyalty to is ridiculous.
Right.
And the thing that Trump nailed the first time around, he nailed that people were dissatisfied. They wanted alternatives. And they kind of didn't care what those alternatives were.
Sure.
Because the one thing they know for certain is, you know, from Reagan through Clinton, through both Bushes and Obama, there's been one trend, which is that the rich have been getting richer.
Right.
And the rest of us are looking around at vast wealth and have no access to it.
Right.
And people are working 2-3 jobs.
You know, and as far as globally, this rise in populism from the alt-right, I read a few articles, some BBC articles, and one of them, the headline mainly said, the rise of the alt-right and the death of the center-left. Because that's exactly what's happening, is that you cannot combat the alt-right and the extreme right, which leads to fascism fast. We're already seeing it in 2 years.
Yeah.
You cannot combat that with, we're going to meet them at the table.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to sit down with them and we're going to discuss. So you have to have, I guess I don't want to say balls, because I think a woman could do a great job without balls. But you have to have some guts.
Metaphorical balls.
Yes,
yeah.
you have to have some guts in order to get something
absolutely.
done.
So I was in Winco with my wife and son earlier this week, and literally the guy in the queue in front of me had a swastika the size of your head on his shoulder on one side and an SS tattoo on the other. And 5 years ago, that guy would have worn a shirt in public.
Sure.
And now he's standing there, like, amusingly not able to, like, I was, you know, just glaring at him because, I don't know.
I do the same thing.
Something's changed in our society where
it's okay.
Where it's suddenly okay to express your freedom and to have your First Amendment right to believe in an ideology that intrinsically requires millions of people to be killed. And this is the thing with actual Nazis, is you cannot be a Nazi or a Nazi sympathizer without believing in genocide. It comes with the package. And therefore, it falls outside of the normal protections on free speech.
Well, and you see in the anti-immigrant movement in this country where there's, you know, I think there's been 6, 8, 7, 8 reported deaths of children.
Yeah.
Children in these concentration camps, because that's what they are.
Yeah.
That it's a small number, you know, and again, collateral damage, because the people are like, I'm tired of losing my job, which I'm not losing. And it's just atrocious. And you see these comments from people on social media because they've gotten this me versus them attitude stoked. They may not, I guarantee people that are cheering on Trump for doing these anti-immigrant kind of movements are cheering it on, do not consider themselves Nazis, and they probably aren't Nazis, but they're definitely going towards that I think that step, you know?
It's become a bit of a cliche, but the whole first they came for blah blah blah
Right.
was done by a Protestant pastor called Niemoller. And it wasn't just a rhetorical device for him, it was literally the case. So he watched the rise of fascism and was like, all right, well, I guess they're going after godless communists, so I can deal with that,
right.
You know? And then it was the Jews, and he was like, well, I mean, you know, they are a bit Jewish after all. And it just, like, it escalated until eventually it was like, you are now the enemy of the people. And this is the thing, is once you designate people as enemies of the people, then anybody who crosses you for any reason becomes an enemy person.
And you're seeing that obviously with the media.
Yeah.
That, you know, that's kind of one of the reasons that I do this, because it's a big middle finger, like, we're not going to shut up.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not the media and I'm not a journalist, but yet, you know, we're not going to stop, you know, and it's scary. So as far as this coming election, I want to talk about that real quick, and then I want to talk more globally. But in the 2020 election, what do you see as the answer to Trump? How is he going to be defeated? He's not.
Well, no. Very specifically, the answer is not Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And I don't mean in a kind of negative sense of like, you know, anything but Joe. But I mean, everything that Joe Biden represents is what the Democratic Party must not do.
Yeah.
They cannot tell people, yeah, it's absolutely fine. We just need to deregulate more, you know, fewer taxes, but we'll be nice and liberal to each other about it.
Right.
There are massive, deep systemic problems in many democracies around the world, particularly in the United States and in the United Kingdom. They are fundamentally a result of massive wealth inequality. And they cannot be fixed with more of the same.
Right. Well, with Joe Biden, too, that, you know, who should the Democratic Party be answering to? The center right or the Democratic Party? You know, it seems like the Democratic Party is going progressively left. And, yeah, that scares off people in the center right. But those people in the center right are still persuadable because Trump is a Nazi. Yeah. you know, and so...
I think at the most basic level, if you are a libertarian, say, and you are looking out at the environment, and you generally be considered center-right, right-leaning, and if you're looking out at the environment and you're thinking, well, you know, on the one hand, there's a bit of redistribution, and on the other hand, there is like active embrace of the vilest and most vicious forms of tyranny. And you end up choosing the tyranny because you don't want to pay taxes, then you were never on the center.
Sure,
right?
Exactly.
And I think that's the thing, is that what we're seeing is a lot of pretenses falling away. It's becoming much clearer who people always were. There was a kind of bridging to the center taking place over the last 40, 50 years, people pretending to be much more centrist than they were.
Right.
And, you know, there are a few kind of areas, immigration is one, where it starts to become pretty clear pretty quickly. But I also think there were a lot of people who maybe didn't realize that their views were...
a certain... Right. There's tests that you can take that are interesting that will show you where you actually fall. You know, as far as 2020, the candidates that... I'm obviously a Bernie supporter, and the biggest reason that I am, and I'd be okay with Elizabeth Warren because I think that she's just right there with him. She hasn't shown quite the same track record, but there's things I really like about her, even over Bernie in some ways. But the thing that I like the most is that someone like Tulsi Gabbard, who isn't probably viable as the president, but she checks off boxes that the right would appreciate because she would be maybe vice president or secretary of state, secretary of defense. She's former military.
Yeah, former military, pro-Second Amendment from what I remember.
Right. She's she's against interventionism to just like continuously start and pester these different, you know, places, especially in the Middle East, where we've put our head in over and over and over again. Because with Biden, it's again like Clinton. Biden gets elected, we're going to war with Iran. I mean, maybe not quite that. With Hillary, it was a given.
I mean, with Hillary, it was a given. I think Biden's issues are not so much the foreign policy element. I think that Biden's problem is that he thinks that the Obama era is what we need to go back to.
Right, which was extremely unpopular with people in the center right.
Yeah, it was unpopular with people on the center right. It was unpopular with a lot of Democrats who felt that there wasn't enough, like... social justice, redistributive policy.
Right.
And...
The biggest reason was because of healthcare, because of Obamacare, because working...
And the biggest recession that we've
that
ever
they were
seen.
correcting. But with Obamacare, it was without the mandate. I mean, we've gone over this so many times, but realistically what happened is it hurt people that were really trying to have upward mobility. It kind of eliminated that because their insurance went from being, you know, affordable to being not affordable, and it allowed people that were not covered to get covered. Now this is the thing that people don't wrap their head around with universal health care, and it's going to be paid for by, you know, a tax on the toppest margin, you know, and marginal tax rates that people are like, but like you said, the scary part is that it can bounce around the people will just move the businesses. So it's, we're at a loss, you know,
I mean, so that's a classic collective action problem, which is that it's not in anybody's immediate personal best interest.
Sure.
But it's in everybody's long-term collective interest.
Well, like climate change.
And basically what needs to happen there is people just need to grow up. And the irony of it is the people that are most grown up in all of this are the kids. They get it because they don't have the luxury of bad ideas. And one of the things that's been really interesting chatting to and teaching UO students is even the ones who are Republicans, for them, universal healthcare is a no-brainer.
Right.
Like, it's like, why are we actually arguing about this? We can argue about freedom of speech and where the boundaries are. We can argue about public funding for education and stuff like that. But healthcare is basic. And everybody else in the world does it a different way.
Right. And it's just so much cheaper, like in the long run.
Yeah.
And I think that there could be ways, if it's a 4% tax, right? I think there's ways that an employer could be like, come work for me, I'll pay 2% of that.
Yeah.
There's going to be ways that it can be negotiated. People just don't have the courage to say, let's just have a rocky couple years. It's already not doing well.
Yeah.
Make some change, and it's like climate change. It's the same thing. People are like, oh my gosh, we need to do something to help the environment, but not now.
Yeah.
Because if we do that now, that could really disrupt things.
And it's kind of a gambler's fallacy thing where you've got these sunk costs in a certain way of doing things. You're like, well, I mean, it's going to cost me, it's going to cost me $50 to change, even though it's going to cost you over the long run thousands of dollars going down the other route.
Right.
You worry about the $50 in your pocket right now. And one of the things, going back to populism, is when you are unscrupulous and you have a populist agenda or a populist, I guess, a way, approach, then you can take advantage of those fears. And this is why we worry about populism swinging to the right, is it starts from ways of thinking that maybe you'd expect it to be naturally leftist. It's about a fair and equal redistribution. It's about government taking an active role in making society more just. But it's very, very easy to whip that up into, oh, well, it's not because I'm failing you as your elected leader that there are issues. It's because of those people over there, whoever they are. Gays and Jews and Mexicans,
right?
And,
whatever,
like plucks people's strings,
right? So back to the global thing. I wanted to talk about some of the major players that we're seeing in this rise of populist alt-right movement. Brazil is a good example of where we need to see what's happening in Brazil and take serious pause about supporting somebody like Trump. Because what we've seen is that the degradation of the institutions, and Brazil was doing really well. They had energy independence. They had switched the way that they were doing fuel, right? Wasn't it sugarcane? They had some modernized, newer way with, what is his name? I wrote it down. Lula. Lula was beloved. And then, was it during the election, what had happened is he was running against Bolsonaro, and there was all of a sudden this corruption charges came against Lula, and then the minute that Bolsonaro won, so was Lula jailed before the end? He
was jailed, he was in jail during the election campaign.
So lock her up, like you saw that, you know what I mean?
And The Intercept revealed recently a bunch of conversations between, and I strongly suggest your listeners go and look that up.
Yes.
A bunch of text message conversations, I think they were, between the judge and who sat on that case, and members of the right-wing apparatus, and effectively they cooked the entire thing.
They cooked the whole thing. So Bolsonaro,
it was a judicial coup.
The minute that he was elected, Bolsonaro, and of course he's going to be elected because Lula is in prison. Which is going to end up being something almost like I don't want to say Mandela. You know what I mean? Like, he's locked up. This was a beloved man.
Yeah.
And he's locked up. The minute that Bolsonaro was elected, he appoints the judge who put Lula away as his
chief justice,
justice minister, because they're a socialist country, right? It's like a social democracy in Brazil.
I don't know enough about
they call them ministers,
precise...
prime minister,
it's a parliamentary system.
Okay.
Or at least it's a hybrid system with a presidential and a parliamentary.
Okay. So
but it's federal. It's a very
But it was like you said, it was a judicial coup. Yeah. And I mean, if you're listening to this or you're watching this, I really think that you should just Google Brazil's new leadership, because it will be appalling to you. And we need to see. So when you see somebody talking about lock her up about Hillary during the 2016, I don't care who it's about. This is why some of the push from the right, or from the left with impeachment and stuff, impeachment is why I think we need to act now. Because if you don't act now, if after Trump, everyone's like, after he's out of office, he's going to be jailed. I don't know if I want that, because that's not how we do things. But also,
8 years of...
Oh my God, it's over at that point.
It's 8 years when you are already exhibiting a lot of signs of no longer being a fully functional democratic entity.
Sure.
Are very worrying. And the thing about democracy is it's a constant learned behavior. You have to do it every day. You have to, one of the things that really impressed Alexis de Tocqueville about America when he did his tour of the country was this democratic spirit, this idea that every American thinks of themselves as the equal of every other, and whether you're sipping brandy in the halls of the mighty or chatting to your barber, everybody thinks that and believes that their opinion and their right to have one is a valid opinion. And that was very different from the Europe of his time. Now, that spirit and that kind of constant participation is starting to fade in American life.
Yeah.
And people are allowing themselves to be directed, they're kind of mortgaging their consciences, in a sense. They're giving them over to be owned by Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders. You will find you will find ideologues, nutters, who will just spout the party line.
And this is why it's so scary, because I truly know that I read enough from different sources that I like to think for myself now, and in supporting Bernie Sanders, and I will call him out on stuff. But this is the hard part, is that we're finding that if you give an inch to someone, so you're like, I don't like this part, and they're like, yep, that's why he's unelectable, and it's so scary. I don't know. It's just really frustrating.
I think when it comes to the phrase unelectable, I think we can just never use that phrase again.
Right, sure.
Because Donald Trump was unelectable.
Right.
And the polling is pretty consistent.
I think Hillary Clinton was unelectable. I think that's the reality that people forget, is that... and again, it's like Trump did it's a combination of great analytics and stoking fears that they definitely studied on how to manipulate. That mixed with the DNC deliberately fighting Bernie Sanders back. So again, this is what I'm talking about, is that Bernie Sanders, the Bernie bros, have been blamed by a lot of centrists for allowing Trump to be elected. And it's like, how about you listen to your party, And so it's insanity.
Just one more thing on that when you have those people, the same people, now saying, oh, well, don't attack Joe because it's bad for the party. So, okay, so whoever you're putting forward can attack anybody else. And you can attack others. What they did to Bernie last time around was atrocious. And there are... misguided, especially young men, who ended up voting for Trump as a protest. Yeah. And you've got to remember that Trump's margin of victory was very, very narrow. Right. And it came from a cynical look at the chessboard.
To watch it all burn, yeah.
And to say, these are the places where I need those electoral college votes. And I will do whatever it takes to speak to those people. Right. Hillary ran a complacent, out-of-touch campaign. But at a more basic level, there is only one person to blame when a candidate loses. It's the candidate.
It's the candidate. So my hope is that Bernie Sanders stays in this long enough to... not so long to hurt somebody like Elizabeth Warren, but long enough to where he's the enemy. Yeah. And because there's so many people that they're blaming this on, and if they try to package, the right is going to try to package Bernie and Elizabeth same face. Essentially like it was with George W. Bush, that like a vote for McCain is a third term for Bush, which is not really it wasn't going to be true. I mean, that's a whole different animal. Yeah. But that's my hope, is because I don't think that Bernie's going to become president.
No, I think there's a few things with Bernie. I think that frankly, the fact that he's Jewish is not going to that's going to be enough to turn a lot of people off.
Sure, and then the fact that he's tired. I mean,
the fact that he's tired.
Yeah,
But the thing that he's done is he's fundamentally shifted the debate in this country.
100%.
And for me, someone like Elizabeth Warren, the combination of the kind of Bernie firebrandness with Elizabeth Warren's kind of, I have a plan for that. Yeah. I think is a powerful one. You kind of use Bernie to sort of open the door, and then maybe Warren's the one that steps through. Right. I've looked at the rest of the field. I've not been hugely impressed by anyone else.
What about Buttigieg? I mean, just as far as I know we're not supposed to say not electable, but electability, you know, he checks off a box. Former military. Yes, he's gay, but I think that he approaches it in a good way. I think, not that there's a wrong way. I'm just saying that I think people are like, he's tough about it.
I think he neutralizes the prejudice against him quite effectively.
Very well, yeah.
My worry about him is he's very young.
Yeah.
And this is the same with the you know, the Betos and the rest of it, the kind of young field. And, you know, much as I have massive respect for Tulsi,
she's just not gonna get
you know. So I think he's done a good job, but there are a bunch of kind of key issues. The race issue has come up a couple of times, and at the end of the day, you're not going to win without black Americans if you're a Democrat.
Right.
And you're not going to win without black Americans, A, coming out for you to vote, and B, being your activists.
Right.
And
Bernie has a lot of that.
And Bernie has had to do a lot of work, actually.
Sure.
So a few of my black friends will be very clear on the fact that say, I love Bernie, but he was terrible on race at the last election.
In the last election. And
he's doing a much better job now. You know, you compare that to Biden, who has this like historic association where people think, because he would speak to black people at all in the time when he was coming up, he was seen as being super progressive. Now things have moved on a lot since then, and it may be that like grandmas will go, oh, you know, we know Joe and we like Joe, but younger than that, the black community has had to become very sophisticated in its analyses and its ability to make judgments on candidates.
Right. Well, we'll see. I mean, I can't wait for the Iowa, you know, caucus, because it's gonna be really telling, you know. And I think my prediction is I think it's gonna be Elizabeth Warren that's gonna win it.
I think so. Yeah. Well, I hope it is, because after Trump won the last election, the first thing my wife did was to put $5 on Elizabeth Warren winning 2020. So that, I mean, and she was a long shot at that stage.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, it's going to be telling. I mean, we didn't mention Kamala Harris, but I didn't really intend on this being about the 2020 election. It's impossible for it not to be. The big thing I want to wrap up, but the big thing, you know, global populism. This show is not going to be something where you're going to get all the information you need on this. You really, as listening to this, you need to Google. Yeah. There's really good. I don't know if I can throw it in the show notes or not, but there's an article, a BBC article, maybe I can. That the legality of it. I don't want to get sued.
I think you can. You can link to a publicly available.
I think I'm going to throw that in the show notes because there's an article that I read that really shows a lot of the different countries, from Hungary and to the Netherlands, like Geert Wilders. Oh my God, that guy is just heinous. And this shows populism in a nutshell. I want to tell a story about 10 years ago, maybe more. I was watching the 700 Club because I used to watch the 700 Club to get motivation to write punk rock lyrics. It worked every time. And they were talking about Geert Wilders, who is I wrote it down, he is the party leader for the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands. Yeah. And he is disgusting. So what he talks about, he's so anti-Islam, and he talks about how they're dirty, repulsive people. And he's an atheist, but he thinks Christians are better, but because, and I'm not quoting, but it's paraphrasing, but he literally said something to the effect of, Christians are better because they're easily manipulated to do what you want. And they were showing this story about him, how he's on 24-hour protection because he's hated in his own country, but yet there's enough of a movement that he keeps getting support, like the person that you saw at Winco with the swastika on their back, that this guy keeps getting elected. And when they cut back to Pat Robertson on the 700 Club, he said, we need more people like him speaking his mind. And I just thought to myself, the only thing you agree with him is that you hate Muslims. That is literally the only thing. He doesn't believe in God. He said straight up that Christians are just easily manipulated. Oh my God, it was so...
I mean, there's a whole, a lot of my research is on how Muslims have been the legitimate enemy for the last 10, 15 years.
Totally.
So while it wasn't cool for a while to be overtly racist, you could still get away with being bigoted against Muslims because Islam isn't a race, and anyway they're the enemy because 9/11 and they're fighting back against us in Iraq.
Well, that's the thing. It's like these countries, we didn't even really talk about how the UN, like Putin, is really pushing to end the UN, and that what's breaking down the UN is these countries in the UN are allowing immigrants from Muslim countries that are war torn, because these people are refugees that are leaving death.
Yeah,
and so
often situations that are created by our own foreign policies.
Right.
But yeah, when it comes to, Putin's very, very effective at undermining institutions where others have already given him a gap. Like, the reason why his strategies have been effective is because there was already a mistrust of institutions, whether it's the US electoral system, whether it's the United Nations, which is a result of countries like Britain and America failing to use those institutions properly in the first place.
Right.
He's only cranking up the volume on stuff that was already going on. He's just very, very clever at doing that.
Well, and then Syria, because we had intervened so long in different places, and the approach that Obama basically started and that Trump continued in Syria was like, let's just kind of take a step back. It's allowed Russia to go in there and just basically control the entire situation. I mean, Russia's playing us big time. They're playing everybody in the world right now. And they're using our old playbook, So
this is all classic CIA stuff.
It's crazy. Let me make sure that we covered everything. I think we did. We talked about Brazil. We mentioned we didn't get to Duarte, which, oh my gosh, if you guys aren't familiar.
Should we just settle on the fact he's not a very nice man?
He's not a good guy. Yeah, he's not getting a Christmas card from me. I think, if you were unfamiliar, just type in Filipino leader, and oh my gosh, Duarte is something else. We talked about, populism on both the left and the right. So I think we've gone over a lot. I'm gonna put that article, in the show notes of this, because it's a really good read. It's an easy, quick article for people to read about the global rise of populism and the alt-right across the globe. And so, I want to have, we're going to have a lot of talks about this 2020 election because it's coming. I can't wait for the first, the Iowa caucus to actually be done so that we'll see, because that usually gives a little bit of a tell. I don't think the winner of the Iowa caucus has actually gone on to, of either party, the opposition party, has gone on to win the election in a while. So it's not like it's the end, but what it's going to do is it's going to make people at the bottom drop off.
Yeah, it'll set the tone for the rest of the race.
Right. I don't think I'm going to cover the next debate because it's still the 20 people. We already did that one. It's not really worth, but we'll touch on it in different things. So, Kaz, it's always an honor to have you. I appreciate you coming out and talking to us. It's always great. If you're listening to this, remember you can always go to strpod.com for merch and all kinds of different stuff. We're putting the videos now up on YouTube, and you can also find them on the website strpod.com/video, and then also on Facebook, which is real easy. Just follow Spent the Rent Podcast. So thank you guys for listening and watching, and Kaz, it's always an honor. I'm going to end this with a song by a local punk rock band called Dead Fucking Serious. The song is called Anarchaic, and I chose that one because it was the longest one, because most of their songs are like 35 seconds. Sammy Warmhands is the lead singer, and give a shout out to Sammy. Their punk band is something incredible. Sammy Warmhands is one of the most diverse artists in Eugene because he does rap, he does hip hop, and then he also does like crazy hardcore punk. And they have a new album coming out and a show coming up at Old Nick's. So check out Dead Fucking Serious. They'll be, if you're on Facebook, you can click right on the name and it'll highlight it, and then it'll go right to their page. So this is Dead Fucking Serious with Anarchaic. Kaz, thanks again.